Hi, welcome back to my channel. In part one of this series, I showed you how I took my overbust corset pattern and turned it into a corset body pattern and how I did all the toiles and fittings along the way. In this part, I'm going to show you how I make the corset, and then in the third part, I'll show you how I embellish it. And then after that, I'll also show you how I make all the accessories to go with Jazida's outfit. So I've now redrawn and recut my pattern with the small changes from the final toile fitting. So I've lengthened it just slightly coming down at the front over the top of the leg, and I've lengthened it just slightly at the back as well. I'm going to be making this corset body from black satin. So I've cut two sets of the pattern. One will be the outside and one will be the lining. I'm using the same satin for both. The black satin for all the pieces has been interfaced and then basted onto a single layer of calico. To assemble the corset, I'm going to join all the pieces of the lining and all the pieces of the outside separately and then join the two layers together. So to join it, I'm going to pin each piece right sides together, stitch my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, then I'm going to do a second line of stitching just to make sure it's really strong. Then I'm going to clip my seam allowance, and on the outside I'm going to top stitch it open either side, which will give us a really nice flat seam. So this is how it looks at this stage. So that's one seam just pinned. This one I've done 2 lines of stitching, and then this one I've stitched it open. So on the outside, it's hard to tell because it's black. There you go. So on the outside you can see there's a line of stitching either side of the seam. And then that's how it looks on the inside, and I've just trimmed all the excess seam allowance off. And again, let me show you the double stitching close. So I try and stitch as close to the first line of stitching as I can when I do the second line. So I'm going to stitch all of my seams together like this, apart from the centre fronts and centre backs. Here's how the corset's looking at the minute. So I've got the 2 halves of my outside and the 2 halves of the inside, and while I was stitching it I sewed my hanging loops into the side seam of the lining pieces. Next I'm going to join my outside and lining of each half together at the centre back. So I've pinned both sides right sides together. These are my 2 centre back seams, and I'm going to stitch from the top down to where the opening and the boning is going to stop. So this line of stitching down each side back is joining our insides and outsides together. Next we need to join the seam here to join the 2 halves together. So what I'm going to do is lift each side up like that and pin them so each half will now be joined together. Making sure I line everything up. So I'm going to continue stitching this line from there right down to the bottom on this side, and then I'm going to flip it and I'm going to do exactly the same on this side as well. So I'm now going to stitch both of these sides, right sides together from the bottom of my stitching down to the bottom, and as we did before I'm going to do a double line of stitching. So this is what you end up with. So we've got our lining and outside joined here and here, and then we've got our centre back seams joined here and here. So next I'm going to clip all my seam allowances. I'm going to clip right down to the stitching. I'm going to cut like a little V shape out here because we need that to pivot, and then once I've done that I can turn everything with the right sides on the outside. So this is how our centre back looks with it all sewn together. So we've got the seam there for the opening, which will have the boning and the eyelets, and then the join from the bottom of that downwards. Cool. I'm just going to go and press these seams open a little bit, and I've cut opposite sides here, so I've left my seam allowance longer on this side and then on the opposite side up there, just to reduce the bulk a little bit when we stitch it all together. Then I'm going to do a line of top stitching from the top all the way down here, so it looks the same as the other seams we've already sewn, but I'm going to stop joining the layers probably about 1 inch from the bottom, because I need to be able to join the piece of elastic with the hooks and eyes on in there. So this is the centre back opening with the top stitching done, and I just did a little bit of stitching just at the bottom of the opening there just to help reinforce it. Just a little note about when you're using this method, This method of doing the seams open, even with the double line of stitching, isn't strong enough if you're doing a really tight lacing corset, if you want a lot of reduction, or if you're not particularly squishy and you have to give your corsets a really good tug to get that reduction. So if you're doing a really tight lacing corset, I recommend you do your seam allowances all going to the same side, and then make sure it goes the opposite way on the other side. So if that's your seam of your lining and your outside when they meet up, get your lining going that way and your outside going that way, so they end up like that. If you go the same way, it ends up really bulky. Jazida's very curvy anyway, when she doesn't take a lot to reduce, so this method is fine to use for what I'm doing. So the next thing to do is to join all the layers together. So to do that, I'm going to stitch along the top and bottom, make sure everything's lined up, and then I'm going to pin and baste through each seam, making sure the seam allowances are completely lined up, and then I'm going to top stitch down it. So what I do is I take a pin, and from the outside I put it right through in that seam, and then I turn it to the inside and make sure it's coming up through the seam on the other side, and then put it back through again, making sure everything's lined up. So I'm going to do that down all the seams, then I'm going to baste them into place, and then I'm going to use my machine to stitch right in that seam there through all of the layers to hold the lining and the outside together. So this bit's really time consuming, but it's totally worth taking your time and doing it right. The only seam we're not working on at the minute is the centre front seam. This is how my corset's looking with all the layers sewn together. I ended up stitching on the stitching either side of each seam as well, stitching through all the layers just to hold everything nice and firmly. And I've also stitched along the bottom as well through all the layers, because I'm going to be putting my boning in from the top. Next I'm going to add the hooks to the centre back. So I've pinned them on right sides together. I'm going to stitch through just the top layer, and then by hand I'll turn that under and then top stitch through all the layers. So after the hooks are stitched in place, I'm then going to sew all my boning channels. So I'm going to be sewing boning channels next to each seam and in the middle of each panel. I'm going to stitch the bone channels the full length of the corset, and then I'm just going to do a line of stitching at the places where the boning needs to stop shorter than the actual corset. And I'm not going to stitch anything further forward than the side front seam at the minute, because I'll do all of this when I put the zip in the front. So the next thing I need to do is join the bottom of the centre fronts together and insert the zip. So I'm going to fold it outside sides together, and I'm going to pin my centre fronts together. So that's my centre fronts pinned together at the bottom. I'm going to stitch up about 1 inch, and then I'm going to press the seam allowance back on the outside layer. Okay, so now that's pressed, I'm going to put the zip in. We're using a zip because Jazida's going to be wearing this for burlesque performances and needs to be able to take it easily off on stage, which is why the zip's going to go right as far down as we can for that opening. I'm using a chunky open-ended zip, but I've cut the open-ended part off just because it's a bit lumpy, and I've just stitched it and then put glue over it to stop it coming open accidentally. So next I'm going to pin it in and stitch it into place. I'm actually going to stitch the teeth just underneath the edge because we want to try and hide it as much as possible. Once I've got it all pinned in as I want it, I'm going to use my zipper foot to stitch it into place. And then once I've done that, I'm going to join the bottom of the centre front of the lining together, and then I'm just going to hand stitch the seam allowance down to the inside of the zip. So I've got the zip in, and when it's lying flat it looks really good, but when it's pulled tight I think those parts are just going to lift up a little bit too much. So I'm actually wondering if I might be better off unpicking it and finishing the seam allowance right next to the teeth, but it's going to make the zip a lot more visible. We're going to be putting a lot of crystals and appliques on there, so I'm wondering if it might be better to leave it like this, because I can crystal right up to the edge on these. And maybe the weight of the crystals will help hold that down. Yeah, I think I'll leave it. When Jazida tries it on next, if it's looking really bad, I can unpick things and change it, which will be, it'll be a pain, but it's not impossible. So yeah, I'll leave it like this for now. So I've just pinned the lining down on the inside, and the way it's holding it, when I pull it, it's not lifting up nearly as much there as it was before. So I think leaving the zip sewn like this was the right decision. Now the zip's completely in, the next thing I'm going to do is join the hooks on. So I'm going to join them right sides together like that, and then flip it down, and then I'll turn the back under and stitch it in place to neatly finish the bottom of there. So I've got the hook in at the bottom of the front now. It's ended up pretty chunky down here because of the bottom of the zip. So I guess when you're making something like this, you've got to take into account what it's going to be used for. And in this case, it's because it's being used for a burlesque performance, we need that zip to come as low as possible so that Jazida can get it off on stage. Whereas if I was just making it for someone to wear for an event, then I probably would have stopped the zip a little bit higher or done it without a front opening at all. So this is just one of those little compromises you have to make to get the function of your garment right, as well as the look of it. Now that's done, I'm going to sew my boning channels in the front panels. So that's all the sewing done. So next it's time to bone it, and I'm going to bone it using a combination of spiral steel and straight steel. I'm going to be using the straight steel in the front either side of the zip, and I'm going to be using the straight steel in the back either side of the eyelets as well, and then the spiral steel in the rest of the bone channels. I'm not going to show you how I do this. I've shown you in previous videos, which I'll link. Actually, I'll go and make a playlist that's got all my corsetry videos in, so you can go back. I talk a lot more in depth in the videos and in some of my vlogs about how I cut and sew, how I do the boning and the eyelets. So go and watch those if you want to know this part in more details. I'm kind of assuming making this video that you're not a novice corset maker if you're making a corset body, because it's a pretty complicated thing to start with. So if you do need more info, I'll link the playlist with my corsetry videos below and above. So I'm going to go bone and eyelet, and then I will be back to show you how it's looking. To bone the centre back, I'm trying something that I haven't done before. When Jazida tried on the last toile, the back of this was just bunching up a little bit, so I wanted to bone all the way to the bottom, but we need the strength of the straight steel here either side of the eyelets, but that's going to be too stiff at the bottom here. So what I've done is I've taped a bit of just lightweight plastic boning to the bottom of the steel, and I've got this one in, and you can see that it's just enough to support that bottom part of the back here, and hopefully stop it lumping up where it was lumping up at the bottom of the steel boning before. So I'm going to go with that, and I was going to do a line of stitching here. Something's lumped up inside there, I don't know what it is. I was going to do a line of stitching here, but I don't think I actually need to. It seems to be in really well. It's really tight in my channel and it doesn't seem to be moving, so I'm really happy with that. So this is the corset body all together with the boning and the eyelets in it. So that's how it looks from the front, and that's how it looks at the back. And I've got black ribbon in it at the minute, and Jazida is coming to try it on, and I'm going to just check that everything's okay before I put the bias binding on the edges. So she's going to try it on. I'll just double check there's no alterations or changes needed, and then I'll hand sew my bias binding on. I like my boning to go right to the edges so there's no floppy bits at the top and bottom, so I have to hand sew it because otherwise you're going to be hitting the steel boning with your machine needle. So I always hand sew. I think it gives it a nicer finish as well. It's a bit more time consuming, but I think it's worth it for the finish. And then that will be it for the construction process. So Jazida's here and she's tried on the corset body where we've got up to with all the boning and the eyelets in, and the fit is absolutely spot on. I don't need to make any changes. So here's the front and the back, which means I could go ahead and sew the bias binding on now and get it completely finished, and then I'll be back in the next video to show you how I embellish and decorate it.